So, good morning everybody and welcome back to the second day of our conference Memory of the Past and Politics of the Present. My name is Markus PIEPER, I'm from Dresden and I have the honor to moderate our panel this morning. We started yesterday with a variety of perspectives from different European countries, from Poland, Germany, France, the Ukraine of course, the Czech Republic, Finland and Estonia, and we go on in the same way, having I think it's another dozen countries that we have a look to all the time on the way of finding an answer to the question if our national narratives, our historical narratives are somehow connected to today's politics concerning the Russian war against the Ukraine. So we have today 4 new participants here on the stage from the Russian Federation, the Czech Republic, from Germany and Austria. I will introduce them one after the other. So we will have 4 very interesting presentations now, starting with the Czech Republic. Marie ČERNÁ is next to me. She's a researcher in the Institute for Contemporary History here in Prague, who is the main organizer of this wonderful conference. She focuses in her work on the Czech history after 1945 and recently published an important book dealing with the political, economic and social aspects of the presence of the Soviet army, not in the Ukraine, but here in Czechoslovakia, or today's Czech Republic, after 1968. The name of the book is Soviet Army and Czech Society, 1968 to 1991. It is published now in Czech, and if I'm well informed, it will be in English.
It's being translated.
So it's being translated and will be soon in English on the market as well. And I have found one interesting publication in your long list of publications you have, because Marie ČERNÁ cooperated as well in various software applications that were interesting about liberty after 1945, and this another one about the assassination on Heinrich, I suppose, in 1942. This would be interesting to discuss, but today's subject is a different one. So we are really happy to hear your presentation now, Marie. The title is The Utilization of Historical Memory in the Contemporary Czech Pro-Russian Activism. So, thank you.
Just draw some water.
No.
Thank you.
Ist das zu kurz?
Sorry, I have to change my glasses. A lot of preparation. So, good morning, and thank you for the invitation, for the presentation. I've been recently interested in the way how the legacy of the Great Patriotic War is used as a source of legitimacy for pro-Soviet activism, pro-Russian activism, sorry, in the Czech Republic. But previously, my intention was to include into my presentation more historical moments, which are also interesting. For example, like invasion in '68, which is also in a way treated specifically by this sort of people in these pro-Russian circles. But as I started to prepare my presentation, I realized that I'm not able to squeeze more events into it. So I just focus on the Great Patriotic War. So maybe if we can tackle it during the conversation, we can leave it for it. The obsession with the Great Patriotic War, this can be observed in the contemporary Russia, and that we will hear about it later in this panel, is well known, especially after 2014 and the today wars against the whole Ukraine, when the Russian aggression has been justified as a prolongation of the war against fascism. We have a photo here. This is from a song, Donbass is Behind Us, which is some propagandistic song made by Russian in Donbass, and where we can see blurring of various contexts, which is very common in this approach to the Great Patriotic War. And we see the contemporary Russian militiaman who is meeting from Donbass, who is meeting with Soviet Red Army soldiers, and such a blurring of various spatial and historical contexts allows to Russia to use the legacy of the Great Patriotic War as an argument, tool, or weapon for contemporary purposes. Thus, remembering the war and paying tribute to the historical merits of Soviet Unions and Red Army has much more to do with the present. And that is why the spreading of the Russian world, which we are witnessing now abroad, that comprise complex variety of activities like cultural, linguistic, economic, political, and even espionage, goes always hand in hand with manifested reverence to Soviet soldiers and Red Army merits and martyrs. And it is also valid for the Czech Republic. This vision of a Russian world as a transnational community is, of course, first and foremost matter of Russian diaspora and Russian compatriots. And indeed, international expatriate structures maintaining contacts with Russian state via Rasotrudnictvo and Russian embassies started to emerge in the beginning of the millennium, and also a little bit later in Czech Republic too, the Coordinating Council of Russian Compatriots in the Czech Republic as a roof platform for various Russian clubs and associations who were willing to cooperate with the Russian embassy was established in 2008 and soon has been mobilized around the official memory of the Great Patriotic War. Their interest focused primarily on the more or less traditional ceremonies, as you can see, the celebrating of the Victory Day, laying wreaths and flowers on the graves of the Soviet soldiers, and cleaning and repairing graves, and you can see subotniki, this voluntary works at the cemeteries. And this sort of activities, which could look like grassroots, were promoted by the Russian community press and by embassy and etc., and were connected with various officialities of Russian embassy as well. And also we can see some new traditional like distribution of Saint George ribbon, etc. Special attention was also, like in Russia, was paid to the veterans of the war and to the Soviet dead. This popular searching, so-called searching movement in Russia, in which groups of volunteers search for the unburied remains of fallen soldiers, which was kind of appropriated by Russian state recently, has some kind of parallel in other countries and in Czech Republic too, although in much more modest level. Still, there are thousands of unknown fallen Soviet soldiers and prisoners of the war that can be identified with some tribute can be paid to them, and they can be glorified. And these activities has been since around 2010 coordinated by the Russian Ministry of Defense and its representative at the Russian embassy in Prague. And students of Russian secondary school was first to be asked to help with this identification of Soviet fallen soldiers, but Czech enthusiasts were involved in these networks associated with the Russian embassy too, and they were often awarded and supported by them, as you can see on one of this picture. And of course, a reconstruction of graves and reburial of remains was a good platform for official ceremony, for official speeches, and for giving opinions about so-called falsification of history, etc. This is one of example of a Czech Red Army Club in Brno, which is kind of special among these kind of military clubs and fans of military history. And it has a special position and special context with Russian embassy and Russian compatriot organization. And it had status of foreigner event organizer of battle reenactment in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And as we know, this is very popular activities in Russia as well, these historical reenactments of the historical events. And for example, their members are dressed up in the uniform, participate or assist to official ceremonies organized by Russian compatriots clubs or Russian embassy, etc. They are also supported by the Russian embassy, for example, the publication of books, or they are often awarded. And in 2020, one of the club members received an award from the President Putin himself for her efforts in personalizing the falling Soviet soldiers. And her activities were further promoted in the Russian compatriot press and the Russian media as well. So these people are kind of adopted by these networks and used for specific reasons. This club even have a teenage section where Czech for teenage, where Czech adults playing to Soviet soldiers teach the children how to play to the Soviet soldiers. The Russian emphasis on the Soviet contribution to the fight against Nazism has been accelerated since 2014. Russia activities and aggression in Ukraine elicited rather critical response in the Czech media and Czech political scene and Czech society, when this provoked a counter-offensive among representatives of the Russian world and Russian diaspora. And the main purpose was to neutralize, confuse and discredit the criticism by highlighting merits of Red Army, of Soviet Union, etc., and together with the accusation of the distortion and falsification of history and alleged Russophobia. So, from this time, the disinformation about Ukraine went hand in hand with promoting the cult of the Great Patriotic War. And the new trend was to involve more Czech actors and to create the network of so-called Russian friends, which from that time is really being established. And this this is kind of marginal, but very various group or network of people with various political attitudes, etc. And it's quite, there is a notion from François Storm who calls them a modern Komintern, which is quite fitting to also in the Czech Republic. These Czech friends adopted the Russian political agenda, including a defense of the legacy of the Great Patriotic War, mixed with the anti-Ukrainian propaganda, wrapped in all-encompassing fight against fascism and falsification of history. Already in May 2014, several manifestations were organized in order to commemorate the Soviet soldiers killed in the Second World War. We can see this demonstration near Prague Castle, or manifestation near Prague Castle, and at the same time to support Russia and to protest against alleged Russophobia and alleged lies spread by media. And the same person who organized these manifestation to honor Soviet soldiers organized demonstration against so-called fascism in the Ukraine a little bit later. So it was the main person. And a little bit later, for example, the decision to remove the statue of Marshal Krakow in Prague 6 in 2019 was accompanied by a targeted campaign that was closely monitored, to say at least, by the Russian embassy. And it involved hyperbolic comments and melodramatic gestures, as you can see, of the pro-Russian activist, a little bit like in a manner of the Bronze Soldier affair. And it was associated with aggressive verbal attacks and harassment of the officials who were associated with fascists. And these actions were dutifully reported to Russia and presented by Russian media as a protest from below. Of course, yeah, and later, after the removal, the pro-Russian activists cherish this lieu de mémoire. The pro-Russian activist concern with the legacy of the Great Patriotic War was expressed by traditional commemorative practice connected celebrating the Victory Day and other important moments of the Second World War. In interest in paying to veterans, like in Russia, memorials, etc., but also by transmission of modern Russian traditions, like introducing night wolves and immortal regiment to Czech Republic. In 2015, the efforts of the Russian embassy to facilitate the victory road of night wolves through Czech Republic was supported by both Russian compatriots, especially Cossacks, we can see here, and the Czech motorcycle club that already enjoyed so-called fraternal links with the Russian night wolves since 2004. So they already were in a personal connection with Zaldo Stanov, and just they fructified it this year to help organize this trip, and then we can see the map and the preparation, and finally they arrived to the grave of Soviet soldiers in Prague cemetery. And although by many people it was pointed to the involvement of the night wolves in Russian aggression in Ukraine, and it was somehow delegitimized on this public and political level, and also pointed that the leader, Zaldo Stanov, is on the list on international sanction, their supporters referred to them as the direct descendants of Soviet liberators. So it was quite successful, although marginal, but also quite successful. So over the next few years, every May, the Czech countryside was traversed by a multinational motorcycle convoy comprising the Russian night wolves and their European allies, and more commemorative sites around the country were added to the program. So the introduction to the night wolves was quite successful. And lately, this international cooperation was reinforced by, through invitation to Russia, where Czech motorcycle clubs participated in various activities in this Daroga Pobiedy in Russian. They were invited to the anniversary of Night Wolves in Moscow, and also they made trip to occupied territories. This is from the bike show, this bombastic bike show that Night Wolves in Sevastopol in Crimea are regularly performing, and also Czech motorcycle members were invited to these events. But they were also invited to make a trip through Donbass. And also, of course, these trips were associated with anti-Ukrainian propaganda in their social networks, like putting photographs and commentary about alleged fascism in Ukraine. And in the 2020, when the pandemic of coronavirus didn't make possible for Russian Night Wolf to come to Europe, so they the Czech section substituted them. Yes, thank you. And in 2021, they went in opposite direction to the Russia, and Russian television referred to it as the road home. So they really took the agenda of Russian night wolves. We have another example of transformation or transmitting of the tradition. This is the Immortal Regiment Walk, which is another social movement that had been appropriated by the Russian state, and then further exported to other countries, to Czech Republic as well. What is interesting that on the first picture, when it was organized in 2016 for the first time in Prague, all together with compatriot organizations and Czech pro-Russian activists, in the front line we can see the same person who was previously organizing the demonstration against Ukraine. This movement spread, and next year in 2070s, there were various marches in various towns. And there was also official agreement among one of the compatriot organization in Prague and the representative of Immortal Regiment of Russia. So it has this organizational roof. What is interesting is the way how this tradition is transported in the Czech Republic, where there are not so many relatives you can take with you to the parade. So people resort to some kind of bricolage. You can see Stalin, for example. You can see some general figures of resistance, like Julius Fučík, for example, which certainly is not a relative of the person who is taking him with him. And all these activities were all the time associated with anti-Ukrainian propaganda, and wrapped in this call for fight against falsification of the history. Also, which is interesting, this Immortal Regiment has also an international structure. So the celebrating of the merits of the Red Army can be all coordinated on the international level. This is from one of these activities when also the pandemic didn't allow to do very massive activities. They are composing. The various countries are composing, in fact, some sort of sentence with this spominajem, something like that. So I have to go also to the conclusion. I don't have any conclusion because it's not concluded. And it is, of course, the question how the situation will be after the open war to the Ukraine. Of course, the friendship with Russia manifested through worshipping the myth of the Great Patriotic War is tested now, and it was evident in the most recent celebration of the end of the Second World War in the May, for example. There were no bombastic trips of night walks. Also, there were some, but very limited. There were no marches of immortal regiments, and all these activities were kind of very, very limited or very, very special. So, and we can see some kind of restructuring of the Russian compatriot world and its local allies. And of course, there are new urgent issues like energy crisis or steep inflations, which seems to be much more successful and relevant for mobilization of masses rather than some kind of abstract fight against falsification history. And if we compare demonstrations now, which we have anti-government, and so they took thousands of people compared to the demonstration we had several years ago against Ukraine, which was several, like maybe tens or maybe hundreds of people. So this is rather incomparable. So the pro-Soviet, pro-Russian activists have another issues to use, but nevertheless there are some signs that this legacy of Great Patriotic War remains some kind of in their agenda. So I will finish by that. Thank you for attention.
Děkujeme pěkně. Thank you very much, Maria, for your presentation and as well for bringing us the photos, because I think for most of us these were quite different images of Prague that we all have seen before when we come here as tourists. So thank you for that as well.
There was castle as well.
Yeah, there was the castle as well, but in the background behind people we maybe have never seen before. So directly from the German-Polish border is Frank GRELKA now here. He's a research fellow at the Center for Interdisciplinary Polish Studies at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder. He deals with, and he's not only dealing with, but he publishes intensively about various aspects of Polish, Ukrainian and Soviet history, among others about German occupation in Poland and the Ukraine, and the history of Stalinism and National Socialism. One of his publications is about the Ukrainian national movement under German occupation, 1918 and 1941-42. And here you see already that one of his focuses is on the early 20th century as well. So it's no wonder that today he is going to talk about the German-Russian revisionist consensus over Ukraine 1918 till 2022. Frank GRELKA.
Thank you so much, Markus, for this kind introduction. Thanks to the organizers for this generous invitation to a really inspiring conference. I have been working on Polish-German-Russian relations over a couple of years in the past, and I was thinking in context of this conflict it would be not a bad idea to look at Ukraine between Russia and Germany. And I thought revisionism would be a good concept to look at this triangle of relationship. Actually, yesterday we had this complicated street name, Kremenchova, yeah? Kremenchova, I don't know what is harder to spell for me, Kremenchova or revisionism. Maybe when you hear and you cannot understand me, it's always revisionism, yes? Okay, for this presentation. Okay, so as a historian, I work with the past. However, today I would like to share my thoughts on the present. Usually historians contextualize current events from the past to make more or less educated guesses about present developments. Here I discuss the popularity of revisionist sentiment for German and Russian policy with regard to Ukraine. For revisionism like socialism, communism, and nationalism, the end point was always known or assumed. Territorial aspirations fully satisfied was a point generally situated in the future, and oftentimes in the past, but never in the present. Still, I think the memory of revisionist policies in Ukraine might teach us a lesson for the present. This talk discusses the changing status of Ukraine between two major powers struggling for mutual recognition since the First World War. My arguments are based on earlier research by Holly Case and Michelle Murray on territorial revisionism and the social aspects of revisionist history in international relations. In the past, and this is a general idea of my presentation, and until February 24, Germany and Russia were bound to notions of revisionist solidarity when it comes to Ukraine. I argue that references to a widely discussed World War II German guilt play less a role than German policy of misrecognition of Ukraine since 1918. In my presentation, I will first briefly discuss aspects of German-Russian power diplomacy over Ukraine in the context of the World Wars. Particularly, I look at continuities, discontinuities of revisionist policies until 2022. For reasons of time, I will focus on the periods until 1945 and from 1991, when Ukraine became an independent state. In discussing the significance of revisionism as a concept to explain the current situation historically, I was not concerned with ideas and debates around the possible borders of the Ukrainian nation or ethnicity, rather with the question why the revisionist policy of Moscow and Berlin determined Ukraine as a minor power over the history of the last 100 years. On this slide, you find territorial, ideological, and political aspects of what I call the revisionist consensus between Russia and Germany over the Ukrainian status. On the one hand, Ukraine's status is determined by immaterial factors, for example, by the Russian self-image to be the major power in this region, and Germany's historical role as a gatekeeper deciding over Ukraine's future between East and West. When it comes to material factors, on the other hand, the borders of Ukraine have defined Russia as a major power since the times of the Romanov Empire. From the German perspective, Kiev was always the key to end Moscow's domination over the whole region. The famous phrase by Paul Rohrbach, "He who has Kiev can defeat Russia," has never been implemented in German foreign policy ever since. In his 1915 article, the advisor to the German Imperial Foreign Office was thinking about containing Russia's expansionist aspirations by safeguarding an independent Ukrainian state. On the contrary, the German Ukraine-Politik interests targeted at Ukrainian resources. In fact, decision makers in Berlin rather would not challenge the dominance of the Russian culture in Ukraine to date. In a longer perspective, Russia and Germany were bound to a mutual solidarity as to containing Ukraine's aspirations for a nation-state of its own. During and in the aftermath of the First World War, Ukraine was the main battlefield in the war between Russia and Germany. German and Austrian troops returned to Kiev in January 1918 in an attempt to change the fortunes of war, which has already been lost on the Western Front. This photo depicts the German military in the Ukrainian capital. Right after the abolition of the first independent Ukrainian National Republic in April 1918, the German-Austrian occupation restored a monarchist puppet government under the Russian general Pavlos Skoropadsky. For the Bolshevik Revolution at the same time, Ukraine was the key for the consolidation of their domestic power status. In the years to come, Soviet Ukraine was one of the central stages for Soviet affirmative action. Just little more than 10 years after the Red October, forced collectivization led to what some historians call the Ukrainian Holodomor. One can say that mutual recognition as major powers and the negation of Ukrainian statehood were the pillars of the Soviet-German revisionist consensus precisely since 100 years. That is, since the Treaty of Rapallo in 1922. Again, in the 1930s, Germany and the Soviet Union became the major revisionist powers on the continent. The constant multi-sided competition and surveillance altered the dynamic of domestic and foreign revisionist strategies, and affected the way policies were formed and carried out on the ground. In September 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was formally a non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union that enabled those powers to partition Poland between them. The Wehrmacht took Western and Central Poland, while Eastern Poland became part of the Soviet Ukraine. Under the leadership of Nazi Germany, all tripartite pact member states were pursuing a politics of revisionism since August 1940. Although Axis members had different visions of the new European order, Berlin assured those who committed the most to the efforts against the Soviet Union would be rewarded with territorial adjustments after the war. On this slide, you find a Nazi propaganda poster from 1941, which can deal as an example for Germans' failed promise for a better future for Ukraine in both world wars. Far from retaining or regaining any territories, Ukraine was temporarily under German occupation and a major site of the German genocide of the European Jews. After occupying major parts of Eastern Europe, revisionism turned out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy for Moscow, while for Germany the same policy resulted in a self-defeating prophecy. May 9, 1945 determined the USSR as a superpower, while Germany ceases to be a major power and was replaced by the United States as a status quo power until the end of the Cold War. After the fall of the Soviet Empire in 1991, Russia remained a status quo power in Eastern Europe, and Ukraine became a member state of the Commonwealth of Independent States in the same year. As a major power within the European Union, Germany has continuously sought recognition as the new and old gatekeeper over the region. As Ukraine maintained in the Russian sphere of interest, Germany continued its status quo policy. Here acknowledging Ukrainian independence, they are eager to recognize Moscow as a decision maker, safeguarding security in the region. The Orange Revolution from 2004 opted clearly for an anti-revisionist agenda. That is, for the separation of the authoritarian policy the still governing Russian president has implemented since the year 2000. While the revolution can be called the symbolic end of the post-Soviet era in Ukraine, Russia tried to turn the clocks back. Against this, Polish and Lithuanian leaders joined the Ukrainian anti-revisionist solidarity, while again Germany decided to pursue its separate policy towards Moscow, known as change through trade, Handel durch Wandel. This slogan then continued to be the German doctrine for Eastern affairs ever since 1952. Also after 1991, the most influential lobbies of the German economy, first of all the Ostausschuss, persisted to provide support to companies investing in Russia and in other post-Soviet countries, but significantly not in Poland, the Baltic states, or East Central Europe. Domestic affairs within Ukraine did not change much after the Euromaidan from 2014, when the Ukrainian people fought for their perspective to become a member state of the European Union. Internationally, Germany did not want to renounce Russia as a status quo power in the region for the well-known economic reasons. Again, Berlin sacrificed Ukrainians' European aspirations on the altar of its strategic partnership with Russia. Despite Germany's unilateral action, Berlin's NATO partners in Eastern Europe had to trust that Germany was able to contain the Russian Federation and its revisionist appetite continuously. The Russian policy since 2014, including the ongoing war in Ukraine, can due to Michelle Murray and her 2019 book, The Struggle for Recognition in International Relations, be described as, quote, revisionism as a social phenomenon, end of quote. Revisionism in this framework finds its roots in the social interactions a power has with other states as it seeks to maintain its identity as a major power. Major powers as Russia possess first-rate military capabilities, spheres of interest, but perhaps more importantly are also understood to have certain special rights and duties to maintain the international order. In the same context, Russia's power recognition claims are traditionally directed toward established powers. For example, when the US President Barack Obama called Russia a regional power in 2014, Russia must have felt misrecognized its status as a major power. With the February attack, Russia wants to revise its international position as a status quo power. In this case, the Kremlin instigates an international crisis that captures the attention of established powers and demands a response from them. Most interestingly, from a historical perspective, Russia's strategy forces Germany to give finally in to its strategic partnership with Moscow or to lose its position as a major power in the European Union. For Berlin, this would mean to give up its revisionist solidarity with Moscow over Ukraine. This is what I would call a Zeitenwende, even if the German government might not agree with me exactly on this point. From a historical perspective, however, and I would like to conclude, this turning point is rather a new era of territorial revisionism in Europe. Oh, well, this was already the last slide, yes. So just as Germany pursued the revision of the Versailles peace order in the 1930s, the Russian Federation today is no longer willing to accept the defeat of the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Territorial revisionism is a template under which the goals of the Russian and German wars of conquest in Eastern Europe emerge. From a Ukrainian perspective, similarities between the so-called Minsk Agreement and the Munich Agreement over Czechoslovakia in 1938 cannot be ignored. In both cases, attempts failed to appease the revisionist power by recognizing its expansionist policies since 2014 in Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. Another similarity is that Russia, like Nazi Germany at the time, pretends to be waging a preventive war for the good of humanity itself. The Nazis spoke of wanting to liberate Europe from the Bolshevik danger. Russia wants to denazify Ukraine. Berlin and Moscow justified their territorial claims in the Sudetenland and the Donbass with the supposed persecution of ethnic Russian and German populations in other states. One predictable outcome of this war, in my opinion, seems to be most obvious. Germany's foreign policy will bid farewell to its revisionist legacy in Ukraine and finally submit to the anti-revisionist doctrine of European foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Frank GRELKA. Thank you very much. Frank GRELKA showed us as contemporary historians, as I am one at least, that view back far deep into history before 1945, before 1938 or even 1933 can be a very good idea. Thank you for that. We go on our panel and we welcome Peter Ruggenthaler from Austria now. No, I'm sorry, before I present you, I forgot to say to everybody here, we will hear now all the presentations. If you have questions or remarks, if you have comments, please write them down or remember them, because we will discuss all 4 presentations afterwards. But now we come to Peter Ruggenthaler from Austria. We are really happy that you are here, because I think it was not easy coming here, as all the trains stopped in Austria yesterday because the train workers of the Austrian railway company are on strike. But good that you made it here. So Peter Ruggenthaler is a historian. He deals with Cold War, Soviet Union, forced labor and National Socialism, and he is the deputy director of the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Research of War Consequences in Graz in Austria. A moving spirit, we can say so, an organizer of many Cold War history-related international projects, and the author of his newest book, Austria During the Cold War, which is now on the market in German, but is translated at the moment into English language as well, Austria During the Cold War. Peter Ruggenthaler's presentation has the title Reflections on the Russian Aggression in Ukraine from an Austrian perspective.
Thank you very much. Actually, I do not have a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, but thank you anyway. Let me very briefly explain you the specific situation in Austria, since I was asked to do that. Actually, I would say that the memory of the past did not play any role in the decision-making how to stand on Ukraine or how to stand on the war. Maybe it's just a thesis, because Austria also, together with Russia in the work on reconciliation, within the past 30 years, has overcome the history. Actually, the Austrian government was seen in the last years as very pro-Russian. You may remember how Putin came to Austria, danced together with the foreign minister and so on. Yeah, but the situation on 24th February was very clear. Already on that day, the Austrian foreign minister took a very clear stance and spoke in the evening news on the end of an era, Epochenbruch, that nothing will remain as it was. So when I saw the pictures of your presentation, the first one, all these celebrations on the 9th of May, all this reconciliation work, as we saw it in Austria, was done within the last 30 years, thanks to the fact that both sides, for the last 30 years, the Russian and the Austrian, was ready to do that. The Russians opened the archives for us, we opened our archives for them. I'm not talking about research now, about political, diplomatic history, Cold War history, since you mentioned Cold War conferences and so on, but the humanitarian side. We, for example, published already 15 years ago, a memory book of 90,000 dead buried in Austrian soil, Soviet citizens, forced laborers, concentration camps, inmates, Red Army soldiers, and so on. But all this stopped now. Yeah, we do not have any celebrations on 9th of May, or even the Russian side, I think, did not. I mean, this when you saw the pictures on Brno, it reminds me on a very offensive embassy work in Czech Republic from the Russian side. Nothing in this sphere has happened in Austria in this year. Once Austria was always accused in being economically dependent on Russia. I would now say, after 6 or 7 months of the war, actually it's lasting already more than 9 months, if Austria was dependent or got 80% of its gas at the beginning of this year from Russia, it's now less than 20. I would even really say it was simply driven by economic interests, of course, but not by political reasons. If you just remember the words of Alexander von der Bellen, Austria's president, who takes a very clear stance towards Ukraine. But just remember his words just 4 years ago when Putin came to Austria to prolong this long-term gas contract, when he just simply declared to the audience, to the international journalists, it is very simple, something like this. He said, it is just cheaper. So if really anyone in the Kremlin believed that within this, of course I'm not talking about that they do not use gas as a weapon, actually they do, but the situation also clearly shows that already within a few months this almost is coming to an end, and in the next year I think the situation will completely change. Just let me say some words on the memory of the past. As you know, Austria, more than 1/3 of Austria's territory has been under Soviet occupation from 1945 to 1955 for 10 years. After Austria has been liberated by all the Allied armies, including the Red Army, with all the atrocities, raping and murderers. Of course, in 1955, it was the most important agenda was to get the Russians out of the country, to conclude the state treaty, to get an agreement with Moscow. And the only discussion which came up, of course, and since you were discussing yesterday the issue of Finland, as I've heard, let me just briefly explain or tell you some points on Austrian neutrality, or what neutrality for Austria means. Now, internationally, it's almost seen also or treated as, okay, they want to remain neutral, so they are more or less pro-Russian. This is not the case. Actually, neutrality is a question of identity for Austria. It is mainly based on, not on knowledge. And, let me go back a little bit to the roots. Austria's Chancellor Karl Nehammer at the beginning of the war said that, and he was very much criticized for that, but he is not that false, that, said in German, die Neutralität wurde uns aufgezwungen von der Sowjetunion. So the Soviet Union forced us to become neutral, which is not that false. Because one could argue if in 1955 the Austrian government would have really had a free choice, they probably would have joined NATO already then. Yeah, the communists played a marginal or even not a role, already at the elections in 1945 they took only 5%, which was mostly a consequence of the behavior of the Red Army in Austria. So the neutrality in 1955 was the price the Austrian government was then ready to pay to get an agreement, a bilateral agreement with Moscow, which was not a legal agreement, but just more or less when the Austrian delegation was invited in April 1955 for final talks to the Soviet Union to reach a not formal agreement, so to say, the promise of the Soviet Union to sign the state treaty, to conclude the state treaty, if the Austrian government would oblige itself, after the withdrawal of the Allied troops in October 1955, to permanent neutrality. So it is, of course, written in the Constitution. It is a constitutional law which obliges Austria to pursue the neutrality. So Austrians have learned what neutrality means in 1956, they did so in 1968, and so on. But what neutrality is, it is clearly a question of definition itself by the Austrian government, which, I'm not talking about the evolution of neutrality now, but so if today's Austria's Chancellor still says Austria is neutral, so he's on the one hand, of course, right, on the other, of course, not. So, within the last 30 years, much has been changed, and even the constitutional law has been changed a few times just in order really to join the European Union. Otherwise, it would not have been possible even to join the European Union in 1995. So, compared especially to the neighboring countries, Hungary is a very special case, but just remembering again the pictures I saw in the Czech Republic, I think there is a consensus on the one side that how to stand with Ukraine, how to deal with Putin. If Karl Nehammer went to Putin in the first days after the beginning of the wars, this was, in my eyes, first of all, a signal to the Austrian population, more or less, okay, we at least tried to show it makes no sense, on the one hand side. The other, argument which was put forward was that he simply wanted to see Putin, in which condition. You may remember all the rumors that he just become crazy and so on. He just wanted to see him personally. But actually, if one word on the political right in Austria, since the political arena is very complicated as well, and if they are on a rise at the moment again, we do have now a government coalition, the Green Party and the Conservative Party, but now again the Freedoms Party is about 25% on the first place again, which is cannot be explained because of Austria's stance towards Ukraine, but mainly, again, migration issues are on the top, of course. You see all the pictures, the Hungarian-Austrian border especially, mostly the feeling no one is doing anything against that. And so this is the classical topic of the Freedoms Party is coming back. They took, of course, another stance towards the sanctions, not against the war, but their really meaning is, let us just, the sanctions will not end the war, so we can stop the sanctions and we will live all together as we lived before. So just absolutely mostly playing with the feeling of the people and giving them to understand once the sanctions end, gas and everything will be cheaper again. So that's just, in my eyes, playing with the feelings, as they did also within the pandemic. Yeah. And one more issue I want to raise, and then please just don't hesitate to ask me questions, since I'm coming from Graz, which is ruled since 1 year by a communist mayor. Absolutely not understandable for anyone. A very specific situation, since the Communist Party never played any role, especially in the Cold War and even not after that. Graz is simply, and today they are debating the financial situation of the city, since money is not going out, how to say in English, we stehen vor einem Bankrott. Yeah. So 1 year after ruling, the communists are playing, of course, the previous governments. But it's all, I'm joking about it because it's senseless to speak seriously about that. Yeah, of course, nor ideology played any role. Nor did so, yeah, one can say that, not the party program, of course, but what actually the chairman of the Communist Party is doing is a woman. She's, yeah, helping people. It's like, they are even called like Caritas, yeah. Really going to the roots, helping the poorest of the poor. And it was simply due to the fact that on the days of the elections, almost every second remained at home and did not vote. It was clear that the conservative mayor will stay, but it happened and that it was suddenly a clear victory for her. So, but it was, how to say, not even the Freedom Party who supported all these separatists in Donetsk or Lukashenko, but it was her people of the Communist Party of Styria. One went to Belarus last year, yeah, celebrating with, giving interviews there. The other one went to the People's Republic of Donetsk, celebrating anniversaries there. Yeah, it was a scandal in the media. It was raised up regularly, but yeah, it's for 1 or 2 days there are some reactions, then it calms down, and no one is speaking about that. So this is the really very, yeah, more or less strange situation, but not that easy to explain as it is mostly when I read international news or how they see it. So one can explain everything, of course, but I don't see any danger within this regard for the future. Yeah. So, thank you.
Vielen Dank, Peter Ruggenthaler. Thank you very much for this for this, let's say, surprising remarks on inner Austrian politics and the general attention Austrians paid to the war there, which was new for me, so it was interesting. Please, if you have questions, if you have remarks, keep them, because we have a last presentation now, and afterwards there will be time enough for discussions and for questions and remarks. So today from Germany, but originally from Russia, Aleksey KAMENSKIKH came to our conference today. He's a researcher and author of various publications on public history and critical thinking, for example, on the so-called Polish operation of the NKVD in the Perm region in Russia, 1937-38. He was a board member of Memorial in Perm, the human rights organization and historical organization, and he was associated professor of the Higher School of Economics in Perm, however that is in English. In Russia, I say he was because as you know, the Memorial organization was forbidden in Russia with the beginning of the war against the Ukraine. So most of the members of Memorial had to leave Russia. Aleksey KAMENSKIKH is one of them. He's today in Mainz, in Germany, working at the University of Mainz. But what we really have to say, an important information is, you all might know, but I think it's not too late to congratulate you once again, because Memorial won together with the Center for Civil Liberties in the Ukraine and Aleksey Bialysky in Belarus this year's Nobel Peace Prize. So congratulations for that. Thank you that you came here today, Aleksey. And now we hear your presentation, The Language of the Great Patriotic War. We heard about that from the Czech perspective already today. The Language of the Great Patriotic War as a Substitution, 2014 till 2022.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy for the possibility to share with you with some my observations and reflections on one of the main themes, one of the main topics of the language of Putin propaganda in the conflict against Ukraine. I have to begin my presentation with a kind of disclaimer. The object of my discussion is the Russian public discourse of so-called Great Patriotic War used for description, conceptualizing and legitimizing of the events which began early spring of 2014 with annexation of Crimea, initiation of military conflict in eastern Ukraine by Russia, and continued until February 24th of this year. Since the beginning of full-scale invasion, the character of public discourse in Russia substantially changed. This date is a final limit for the object of my presentation. In this sense, my current report is a kind of retrospection. But I hope this retrospection can help to understand better the tragic events of the last months. Well, since the very beginning of 14, a group of philologists, social psychologists, political analytics, including Ghassan Gusseinov, Alexander Morozov, Maxim Krangaus, and many others, and headed by Marina Vishnevetsky, her photo you see, initiated a project, Dictionary of Changes, in which week by week, month by month, the changes in public language in Russia were traced. It is a very important project for, I think, researchers of the public forms of discourse in Russia. And The materials of the dictionary prove what any person who was a witness of the events of 2014 could remember. The massive use in propaganda language, the terms, images, and rhetorical schemes referring to the narrative of the Great Patriotic War for the description and conceptualizing of the current events. This is an illustration of some main tool which was used by the participants of the projects. And some illustrations, maybe. A few surely from many. The language of a Great Patriotic War, well, this is not very pleasant. I think all of us remember such examples. For example, this person, Igor Strelkov of Girkin, and explain how the forms of historical imagination easily transmitted into actual politics. So-called military reconstruction games became the forms of real military aggression. All these illustrations, I think they are also not needing detailed explanation. So, how could it become possible? How could the language of the Great Patriotic War could become the language for description of the current events of 2014? I think to form the answer on this question, we ought to remember about two central themes dominated in the imaginative canon, if to use a term of Aleida Assmann with her distinction of canon and archive of historical memory. So in canon of Russian public historical imagination, on the eve of aggression. These are, the first, the concept of three fraternal peoples, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. Really a slightly modified in Soviet period version of the concept of imperial times, concept of so-called triune Russian people. Great Russians, Malo-Russians, and White Russians, Belarusians, which from the time of Feofan Prokopovich became one of the central construct of imperial ideology in Russian Empire. Nikita Sokolov, a brilliant Russian historian, demonstrates in his research that since Nikolai Karamzin's memoir on ancient and modern Russia to our days, this concept translated through school history textbooks, forming historical vision, historical optics of Russians. The second theme, the second complex of tropes is the narrative of the Great War and the Great Victory as a main event of the contemporary history, of the modern history. It's very important to have in our analysis that for three last decades, this concept, these narratives of the Great Patriotic War acquired principally new characteristics, which distinguish it from the similar narratives of the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet period. I think a short video may be useful for us to analyze these distinguishing. Sorry, a moment. This video is not so beautiful as Heysakova yesterday, but it is very, very important for us. Only a minute with a half, not half.
Осенью 41-го у стен столицы решалась судьба страны. Красная армия несла потери в боях с превосходящими силами противника. Несмотря на тяжелую обстановку на подступах к Москве, было принято решение о проведении военного парада на Красной площади 7 ноября. Это был парад мужества и непреклонной решимости отстоять столицу. Это был парад защитников Москвы. От стен Кремля они уходили на передовую, чтобы стоять насмерть на московских рубежах.
That's enough, I think. Well, thank you. So, what are the messages of this short public presentation of this form of commemoration? The first, the Great Patriotic War is a meta-historical, eternally lasting event. Its heroes are always among us. They are ready to battle with their eternal enemy. Who is this enemy? Surely, the answer is clear. This is a fascist, some arch-enemy whom the generations of Soviet and post-Soviet people learned to hate. But who is a fascist now, in 2011? Anybody. Anybody who will be marked as a fascist. Surely, this language of Soviet propaganda, in the language of Soviet propaganda, there was a persistent tendency to use in the context of the Cold War the rhetorical figure of a fascist as a universal blank for an enemy, while appealing to the actual experience of the collective trauma of the Second World War. However, it was the actual experience of the generation that have gone through the war that defined the limits of such language. Although, but 2011, there were hardly any members of this generation left. So, freedom for historical imagination. But what event is the object of commemoration in 7th of November parade? For any Soviet people, the answer is clear, surely. This is the anniversary of Great October Socialist Revolution, the main event of the human history. Just to the memory of this event, a parade having place on the Red Square 7th November of 41st, was devoted. This event was included by the historian imagination of its participants in the main Soviet historical narrative. But what is the historical denotate for the parade of 7th November of 2011? The answer is paradoxal, I think. This is a parrot. The sign of parrot is a parrot. Such a way. We observe here a replacement of the constitutive political myth, which consolidates the nation as an imagined community, using the term of Benedict Anderson, surely. If, for Soviet political ideology, such constitutive myth was a myth about the Great October Revolution, which established the principally new form of the human society, and the victory in the World War II was used as a convincing demonstration of the progressive character of Marx, Engels, Lenin teaching, then in modern Russia, the Great Patriotic War and the Great Victory themselves become such constitutive events, remembrance of which pretends to establish the current Russian nation as an imagined political unity. This is a very important difference between the Soviet and... this is terrible. Well, sorry. This is very important difference between Soviet and modern Russian narratives of the Great Patriotic War. And for understanding of the political ideology of modern Russia itself. Not the real events which resulted in emergence of contemporary Russia in its current boundaries. For example, the victory upon GKCP in August of 91st, either the agreement in Belovezhskaya Push and the abolition of the Soviet Union, but the events that predates the very formation of the modern Russian state by 46 years, became in historical imagination the events that had established the current political community. The election of the victory as a constitutive event of the modern political community defines the inseparable ideological identity with the imagined Soviet people. In 2020s, it was formulated in a new version of Russian constitution. And also, it defends the contemporary political revanchism and expansionism, which, after 2014, defines Russian foreign policy towards the states which acquired political independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 2014, the narrative of the Great Patriotic War become a substitutive historical analogy. How does it work? We have already seen that the symbolic figure of the fascist as the eternal enemy in the meta-historical Great Patriotic War existed in the 11 as an empty form. In the spring of 14, this form was filled by a simple sophistic substitution. Its content becomes the image of a Ukrainian who resists to be turned into a part of the triune Russian people. That is, in the logic of propaganda, a fascist in a nationally specified form of the murderous man. Note in parentheses that this actualizes a rhetorical scheme well known to the Soviet propaganda. A Ukrainian who does not want to be a loyal Soviet man is a Banderas man. That is, according to this logic, a fascist. A caricature from satiric journal Peretz. As along with it, Putin's propaganda actively uses the trope of three fraternal peoples, or by 21 imperial version of triune Russian people. It logically arrives at the rhetorical figure imperative of liberation the fraternal Ukrainian people from the fascist Banderovs. We ought to add to this a resurrection of rhetorical formulas from the Cold War era, when the figure of fascist as the main enemy was filled with America. One of many examples. This propaganda formula, we are fighting in Ukraine with America or collective West, just as it was during the Second World War. Sorry, for me as a historian, is a strange, very strange. But in the logic of this language is an absolutely reasonable conclusion. Some quotations. In Putin's meeting with so-called historian activists at 22nd June of 2016, a short quotation: "Every soldier we raise stands in line with those who raise him, because they were such great men that Europe is still at war with them dead, still at war." Oh, sorry. Well, so the image of Ukrainian in this language of 14 and further is splitted. Ukrainian is either, the Ukrainians either do not exist at all, because Ukrainians are Belarusians, a variety of Russians, and the rhetorics "we are one nation" is used, or being rhetorically replaced by the figure of a fascist. They acquire all the characteristics of this archetypical enemy, which is, in this case, a demonized collective West. Some themes that works in this substitutive discourse are the themes of heroical death, which alone can acquire with a sense any human life.
Aleksey, excuse me to interrupt you, because we are really running out of time. It's already...
The part of childbirth. Sorry. State annexation, sorry, the discourse of immortal regiment, the form of universal legitimation in contemporary Russian Stalinist discourse, and, well, a way to legitimate even the discourse of Gulag. Because in Gulag camps, the prisoners worked for the victory, together with all Soviet people. So, that's all. Thank you.
Большое спасибо. Thank you very much, Aleksey, for bringing us back to the propaganda and the images of the Great Patriotic War. So we have a couple of minutes left for if you have questions and comments. We have heard about from the Czech Republic of a mixture of the Great Patriotic War propaganda and anti-Ukrainian manifestations. We have learned about a long tradition of disregard of the Ukraine as a state. In Germany, we had a look inside a neutral country, which is not that neutral, maybe, concerning the war against the Ukraine. And we have watched the reenactment of the Soviet victory parades on the Red Square in Moscow up to today. So we have a great variety of subjects and ideas and presentations. If you have questions, remarks, or comments, please give us a sign. Herr Borowik, we have a microphone, I think.
Thank you very much for the fascinating talks. I have two questions and one comment, one remark. The first question is to Mrs. ČERNÁ. In my communication with right radicals in Germany and with left radicals, I could observe such narrative, and it's very important that this narrative has another side, so it's directed against Americans, not against Germans. And it was very funny to hear from the right radicals that Soviets liberated us from Nazism and so on so far. But my question is it something like symbolical substitution for anti-globalism, anti-Americanism, or real fascinating in this discourse and this symbolic of great victory and so on and so far. I mean the Czechs, so no Russian diaspora. For Russians, more or less it's clear this is something like civil religion for Russians everywhere all over the world. The second question is to Mr. GRELKA. You didn't even mention Vergangenheitsbewältigung. In your talk about the Second World War in the past, the two world wars. My question is, what was the role of politics of memory in this practical politics of Germany in these years? And my comments to the talk of Mr. KAMENSKIKH. What do you think? So, from my vision, this myth of Great Patriotic War is part of so broad ideological construct of this founding myth of Russia, of Holy Rus, and eternal Western threat. And the Great Patriotic War was explained, was treated in Soviet Union from the very beginning, from the time of the war, as some version of this threat, and that was very easy to explain. So, and in this situation, not everyone can be fascist, but fascists are the people from the West who are against Russia. And in this scheme, Barack Obama, for example, can be fascist, and Trump, no. No, not fascist. And Ukrainians are as traitors in this scheme. The traitors of Holy Rus, of us, and on the side of the West. And so, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the. Are there more questions? We would collect now maybe another one, and then let the panel answer. Please.
Thank you very much for fascinating talks. I have maybe a question or a small remark to Aleksey KAMENSKIKH, and I think it was very fruitful and amazing. And let me ask you, what do you think about the role of symbolic in modern Soviet policy and in modern Putinist policy? I mean, the symbolic politics, yes, the role of symbols like this ribbons and George ribbon, immortal regiment, of course, which started as a private event and very sincere event, and then was appropriated by the state as many other symbols, yeah, and the role of something like facade, the role of symbols, fake news, you know, this crucified boy, yeah, like victim of Nazis, which was all fake in Ukraine, but some people got to Donetsk in 2014, 2015, because of these fake, and started to fight Nazis, as they said in Ukraine. And the symbolic, which is very like magic, like the symbolic comes into reality, and finally in the horrible war, yeah? Thank you.
So, thank you. We have questions now. I would add a last question to Peter RUGGENTHALER, because I was thinking of when you presented Austrian's politics and the question of neutrality, as the history is deeply connected to German history and the relations are very strong and the two societies are connected, is the politics of Austria, or the public opinion of the people towards the conflict or the war against Ukraine, somehow connected to Germany, or does it has nothing to do with each other? This would be my question to you. And then I would ask all of you now, maybe beginning with Maria ČERNÁ, answering the questions, and then afterwards there will be a coffee break.
Thank you for the question. I don't think this is a substitute. I think it's something which goes hand in hand. It's one package. As if I can refer to Françoise Thom again, she characterized this new modern Comintern as a group of people who subvert the fundament of European identity. So it means people who subvert, who are against NATO, who are against America, and use all the kind of discourse and this veneration of Red Army is just one aspect of this subversive behavior. Although the veneration of Red Army is not subverted in itself. Yeah, you know, it becomes suspicious only in these networks of this kind of motivation. And if I can comment this, that everybody can be fascist, I would specify that, who is fascist is the person who opposes to someone who fought against fascist. So in this way, Czech representatives who removed Koněv were fascists because they are against Koněv who fought fascists. So this is the logic. The same logic was definition of counter-revolutionaries in '68. Anybody is a counter-revolutionist who opposes Soviets who came fight against counter-revolution. So this is kind of logic. I would say this is similar with this fascist history.
Okay, here we go. Yeah, thank you for this question. Of course, Mikola Borovic, you know, Vergangenheitsbewältigung is something deeply anti-revisionist, yes? So, but we discussed this yesterday after your talk. Ukraine is really a lacuna of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, of coming to terms with the past in the German discourse. Yeah, we have a Vergangenheitsbewältigung coming to terms with Russia, of course, with Poland. So this is, and of course we need to differ between the societal level of society, coming to terms with the Second World War and the war against Russia was of course more war against Ukraine, as we all know, and the political level, the continuity of foreign policy towards Russia. This is here the main point in my presentation. So there's a big need of this discourse between Germany and Ukraine, and I hope when German foreign policy now changes after this war, needs to change, needs to turn into the European concepts of anti-revisionism in foreign policy towards Eastern Europe, then everything will be possible. The question is only, will Germany still be the gatekeeper over the region, yes? Or is it to be Ukraine? Is it to be Poland? I don't know, yeah, these are all open questions.
Okay, should I continue? Okay, actually, German as well as Austrian policy toward Russian was driven by Vergangenheitsbewältigung, by a memory of the past, of course. Dialogue and cooperation, better than everything else. It is very easy to condemn now Merkel's policy and so on. It's understandable, especially as seen as from most Eastern European countries. It's understandable. Now one is, of course, one knows much more than a year ago, or in other words, Putin has shown its real face. But now to say one must have done already earlier or took other steps, it would have been simply impossible for any German chancellor to take another position towards Russia. I mean, it would have been very easy for the Russian side to condemn Germans in, let's say, after the annexation of Crimea as a totally fascist regime and so on. And this was, in my eyes, mainly a reason, of course, for any German politicians, but also for Austrians, that there was no other way than to try to through cooperation and dialogue. And what is so bad about dialogue and cooperation? Of course, now the situation turned out to be totally different, and one has to take a clear stance, if not now, when then, but actually European solidarity shows this very clearly. Difference to Germany, at least, there were no anti-Ukrainian or any pro-Russian demonstrations anywhere in Austria, although the right-wing scene, or that's maybe the somehow not understandable or not reasonable to explain why it is the case that the right-wing party, which is much more on the extreme in Austria than in Germany, at least it was within the last 20 years, now it maybe changes, but I think one main difference is, of course, the communist past of Eastern Germany and the connections on the left-wing side between, or the much more pro-Russian connections from the at least East German society, then this would be the case in Austria. I just gave you the example of the Austrian communists who traveled to Belarus and to Donetsk and so on, but this is 2 or 3 people. Yeah, so that's a huge difference.
Thank you, Peter. And last but not least, in the last 2 minutes that are left, Aleksey.
First of all, Mr. Brovik, thank you for your comment. You are absolutely right. The discourse of Great Patriotic War functions as a part of really more wide discourse. And for example, if one to take Putin's paper on historical unity of Russian and Ukrainian peoples, it's all obvious how he uses the series of layers of imperial and Soviet rhetorics referring to Ukrainians as a part of this triune community or as subjects of manipulations of external enemies. I absolutely agree with you, Shirley. What regards to the war of symbols, it is a huge theme, surely a huge field of problems and research. Well, I take here only one moment, a moment when one or another object in urban landscape became an object of symbolic conflict. For example, the case of Leninapad in Ukraine, yeah? Almost neutral part of urban landscape became a point of conflict, and various forms of dissolution of this conflict, for example, from Lenin transformed in Darth Vader in Odessa, or Bulgar colonist in Volgograd in Odessa region, or Leninapad as I said, as it is. Some other cases are the case of reassignments, переозначивания. For example, the memorial complexes in Katyn, in Sandarmoch, Perm 36, and so on. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
So, Maria, Frank, Peter, Aleksey, thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. And now it's time for coffee. See you back here for the next panel in about 20 minutes. Thank you.